Assalamu alaikum dear students. In the previous lecture we studied about the habitat and the environment, and we studied about the two components of the environment, that's abiotic component and the biotic component. Abiotic component includes all the non-living things in the environment, while as biotic component includes all the living organisms in the environment. It includes plants, animals as well as microorganisms. In today's lecture, we will describe the biotic components of the environment. The biotic component of the environment, it is divided into four groups. That's producers, consumers, scavengers, and decomposers. Biotic component, you already know, it includes all the living organisms. So these living organisms are divided into four groups, that's producers, consumers, scavengers, and decomposers. Now let's try to understand these four groups one by one, starting with the producers. Producers, it includes those living organisms which can make their own food, and it includes green plants. That means producers हम उन organisms को कहते हैं जो अपना food खुद prepare कर सकते हैं, and it includes the green plants. You already know about the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process by which these green plants are able to prepare their own food. Water and carbon dioxide are needed, and in presence of chlorophyll and sunlight, they prepare their own food in the form of glucose. So simply we can say producers, these are those living organisms which can prepare their own food by the process of photosynthesis, and it includes all the green plants. Now let's talk about another group, that's the consumers. Consumers includes those living organisms which cannot make their own food. They cannot make their own food, and they depend directly or indirectly on the producers. That's the green plants. So consumers हम ऐसे organisms को कहते हैं जो कि अपना food खुद prepare नहीं कर सकते, and they depend on for their food on the green plants, either directly or indirectly. These consumers are further divided into three categories. One is primary consumer, another is secondary consumer, and another is tertiary consumers. Primary consumers, these are also called as herbivores, and these are those consumers which eat only plants. It includes animals like horse, cow, goat. So primary consumers are those living organisms which only eat green plants. They cannot make their own food, and they get their food from the green plants by consuming green plants. These such type of organisms are also called as herbivores. Now let's talk about secondary consumers. These are also called as carnivores, and these are those organisms or those consumers which eat flesh of other organisms. These type of organisms, which are called as secondary consumers, they eat the flesh of other animals. For example, we have frog, we have lizard, we have snakes. While as the tertiary consumers are also called as top carnivores, they also eat the flesh of other organisms. That means these tertiary consumers, they are also carnivores. But what's the difference between these two, secondary consumers and tertiary consumers, is that these tertiary consumers, they are not killed or eaten by other organisms. That's why they are called as top carnivores. For example, we have lion, we have tiger, we have leopard. These type of consumers, or we can say top carnivores, they are not killed or eaten by other animals. अगर हम secondary consumers की बात करें, for example, frog, a lizard or snake, although they are carnivores, but in carnivores यानी frog या snake या lizard की बात अगर हम करें, they may be eaten or killed by other animals. But when we talk about the top carnivores, there is no such predator for these top carnivores. So this was about the consumers. So consumers are those organisms which cannot make their own food, but they depend on the green plants for their food. These consumers are further divided into three categories. First one is primary consumer. Primary consumer में ऐसे organisms आते हैं जो कि सिर्फ green plants खाते हैं, and these are also called as herbivores. After that, we have secondary consumers. These are the carnivores, that means they eat the flesh of other animals. But these secondary consumers are killed and eaten by other animals as well. But जब हम tertiary consumers की बात करते हैं, these are called as top carnivores. These are also carnivores, that means they also eat the flesh of other animals. But these tertiary consumers or top carnivores, they are not killed or eaten by other animals. So this was about the consumers. Now let's talk about another two categories of the biotic components, that's scavengers and the decomposers. First of all, let's talk about scavengers. These scavengers, they feed on dead remains of animals killed by predators, and it includes vulture or kite. So scavengers में ऐसे organisms आते हैं जो खुद अपना शिकार नहीं करते हैं, like predators, like tiger, lion, leopard. वो खुद अपना शिकार करते हैं, they kill their prey and after that they eat it. But when we talk about scavengers, they feed on the dead remains of animals which are killed by predators, and it includes these organisms like vulture or kite. Another category is decomposers, and it mostly includes the organisms like bacteria and fungi. And these type of organisms, they decompose the dead remains of plants and animals. And by decomposing the dead bodies, the dead remains of the plants and animals, they get their nutrition, they get their food. So this is what we mean by decomposers. It includes bacteria and fungi. So this was about the four categories of biotic components, that's producers, consumers, scavengers, and decomposers. Now let's talk about the dependence of living organisms on one another and also on the abiotic components of the environment. While studying the biotic component, we came to know that out of the four categories, out of the four groups, there is only one group which can make their own food. That means सिर्फ producers अपना food खुद prepare कर सकते हैं. While as all the three categories, other three categories, that's consumers, scavengers, and decomposers, they depend directly or indirectly on the producers for their food. That means अगर हम बात करें consumers की, चाहे herbivores हो या फिर carnivores, they depend on the producers. इसी तरह से scavengers, they also get their food from other living organisms, and simply these decomposers also depend on the other living organisms. So this is how all the living organisms are dependent on one another. The food prepared by the plants is ultimately consumed by all the other living organisms in the environment. These living organisms, they also depend on the abiotic components. The abiotic components include all the non-living things, be it soil, water, air, temperature, or sunlight. So we can say that all the living organisms are dependent on the abiotic world or the abiotic components of the environment. For example, plants need water, they need soil to grow, they need water, they need air. Similarly, animals also need air and water to survive. So we can say that all the living organisms are dependent on one another, and at the same time they are also dependent on the abiotic component of the environment.